This week I'd like to talk a bit about behaviour. It's an interesting area, and it's come to my mind particularly at the moment because I've got a number of students who are working in behaviour units or with children who have challenging behaviours, and I've been marking a lot of assignments and portfolios where behaviour has been a key part of that. It's a very interesting area because in the most recent Code of Practice, behaviour was removed as an area, a category of need. Instead, it was replaced with social, emotional, mental health. And part of the reason behind that is that there's an understanding that it's not all about the actual behaviour. There's a reason for the behaviour. So the problem is that quite often the behaviour becomes the issue and everything is focused on the behaviour, and the actual learning need gets dropped off somewhere in the back. It just disappears. So it's really important to look beyond the behaviour and work out what is it that we're really trying to look at, what's going on here. Now, Vygotsky, ages and ages ago, did a whole study where he looked at the idea that what ends up happening is if you don't address the actual learning needs of the child, what will then happen is something else will develop. There'll be this secondary need, but the secondary need ends up overtaking the primary need. And instead of looking at the real needs that that child has, we end up focusing purely on this other aspect, in this case the behaviour, and not looking at what's causing it and looking at the real needs that should be addressed. So that's where this is all coming from. So what we need a few things. We need trust and we need understanding. So it's important that our pupils, our children, trust us. And that's not always easy. If we go back to what I've talked about before, which is the child's lived experiences, it may be that there hasn't been an adult that they can trust in their life so far. So building that trust is going to be harder. So we need to work harder at it. It becomes more important if they're not used to trust than less. It's not less important, it's more important. It also isn't something that's going to happen overnight. You know, you have a good conversation doesn't mean that suddenly you have trust. It has to be developed over time. And time is something that we don't always have enough of as teachers, but it's something we do need to take. We need to take that time, give that time to our students, and take that time to allow something to work. Don't just assume. Also, if something works once, it doesn't mean it'll work again. The other thing about time is that we don't address the behaviour in the moment, as in the cause, what's going on, the whole detail stuff. We obviously address the behaviour. We need to make sure that our children are safe, that the child who's exhibiting the behaviour is safe, but also everybody else in our care is safe. So that does need addressing. But the causes behind the behaviour need to be addressed when behaviour isn't an issue. So we need to have time, we need to have strategies, and there's so much out there. There's zones of regulation, which is a really good one, which helps children to identify in themselves and for themselves when something might be about to escalate. They can identify how they're feeling, and that's a really, really difficult thing for some children to do. And sometimes it can be difficult because they have speech, language and communication needs. Sometimes it can be difficult because they have something like autism that makes it harder for them to not just regulate their emotions, but to recognise their emotions and recognise the emotions of others, which can be really important, a big part of this. So we need time when behaviour isn't up here to look at what's been going on. I had something years ago with one of my students who used to call it, it was like a temperature control thing. He used to sort of do an angry meter, as it were. I can't remember what he called it now. Stressometer, that was it, stressometer. And he would look at how he was feeling and he would plot it like a graph almost. And then he'd come back to it again. So it was all done afterwards in retrospect, but he'd come back and he'd plot what was happening at the different times. So, you know, what had made it escalate, what had brought it back down, what had made it re-escalate. Some of the training I received a long time ago, but stuck with me so much. If we look at stress, and if we think, so you get this stress, it goes up, it shoots up, and it starts to come down. Too often we will come in as it's starting to come down, but it hasn't actually reached ground level, if you like. So what happens is you've got stress, it's shot up, it starts to come down, we come in here, and then something happens that sparks it back up, so it goes even higher because its starting point was higher than it was the first time. So we have to give time. It's what I was saying before. We really need not just the time to actually give the whole situation time, as in, let's look at what's going on here and all the rest of it, but actually in the moment. We too often say, oh, they've calmed down now, let's just go back to class or whatever. And they haven't actually come right down. They've started that descent, if you like. They've started to calm, to de-stress, but not enough to go back into a situation that might make it escalate. What if the situation is a sensory need? What if that classroom is just unbearable? And we've seen them begin to calm down, so we put them back into that unbearable situation. It's something we all do. We've all done it, and it's very easy to get this wrong, So as it's easy to get it wrong, we need to work extra hard at trying to get it right. I'm not saying it's easy, but I am saying it's worth it, because people aren't bad people. Bad things happen to people, and that affects them, and it makes them distrustful. It could be simply a frustration. It could be somebody who's dyslexic, for example. Don't know why I've used that example. And they're just so frustrated with this reading that they've got to do that it's just exploded. Or it could be a cover-up. The behaviour might cover up something they haven't understood. Somebody who's maybe got dyscalculia and they're struggling with the maths. And so the behaviour is the frustration. If we just focus on that behaviour, we don't get to look at the maths and what's going on there and how we can support that. So it's just really important to get this right. And it can be for so many reasons. We have children who present with behaviours that we don't want to see in class, but we expect everything to be the same for everyone, but we're not all the same. There's a big thing in schools where it's very much hierarchical, very much this power that there's these adults who know and the pupils who get done to. Well, no, it's actually a joint process. Children are a part of their education. It's not done to them. They are involved in it. They are really importantly involved. There's been lots of there's been legislation and inquiries that support this. You've got the Lamb inquiry, which is now, it's now 11 years old, but it's still just as important, if not more so. You've got in the Code of Practice, the current Code of Practice, we are supposed to take into consideration our children. We don't do education to them. We educate, we learn as a partnership. Well, if it's going to be a partnership, we have to trust our children and help them to trust us. We have to invest in our children. We have to give them the time and the opportunities to develop and to grow. We have to work with them to find out what it is that is causing the behaviour, so that we can address the cause and not just the behaviour. Also the behaviour policy, it comes into play, right? Or the behaviour policy says this, so we've got to do that. But actually that doesn't take into account necessarily the reason for the behaviour. A child who has ADHD, a child who has autism, a child who has a very, very complex situation at home, a child who has various learning needs, a child who has speech, language and communication needs and therefore hasn't processed the instructions, hasn't processed what they have to do. They might have an auditory processing disorder. There are so many different special needs. I can't list them all here. But we need to know what they are and not ignore them. Behaviour was taken off of the Code of Practice, not so that it can become a stick to beat the child with. Oh, look, behaviour is an issue, behaviour policy is not a special needs thing. No, behaviour is quite often a reflection of something else. And it's very easy to forget that, but so, so, so important to remember it. And that's what this is about. Thank you.